Well, welcome back into the Cybersecurity Hub. I'm Seth. Thanks so much for being here on our 4-day journey through the Cybersecurity Hub North American Summit. Easy for me to say. We already had a great session leading into this one, which is how Zero Trust enables work from anywhere and builds towards a SASE vision. Could you think of a more perfect session at a more perfect time? So we really appreciate Tony Lauro and Andy DeClercq for being here. I'm about to hand it over to them, and then I'll be back for live Q&A. If you do have any questions or thoughts, go ahead and pop them in the chat, and we will act on them. Bob's just sent us a note, and I'm going to act on it as soon as I hand it over to Tony, which I'm doing presently. Tony, thanks so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for having us. Again, my name is Tony Lauro, Director of Security Strategy and Technology for Akamai. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Zero Trust. Personally, I'll be speaking a little bit about Akamai's own Zero Trust journey. And then I'll let Andy introduce himself and give his background as well. But, thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And good morning to everybody. I'm Andy DeClercq. I'm Chief Technology Officer with Teneo Group, looking out and delivering solutions around building out SASE and Zero Trust environments for organizations to ensure that, the users, the consumers of data get application performance and security in a trusted manner through active security policies. So when we look at SASE and Zero Trust, they often get blended, and what are they? And there's a lot of myths and truths and confusions around what they are. So we thought it best originally to let's position what this really means and explain some of those assets that need to make it up. And this is about, at the end of the day, it's about a change in IT culture and the way that we look at how we deploy access to assets, access for users, access for applications, and the way we connect to things that we need to do our day-to-day job. And as we all know, once you're trusted, you're untrusted, and it's about trying to understand how that builds out. So some of the things that get explained here are around, is it easy to build out SASE solution from multiple products? Is SASE a product? Is Zero Trust a product? Those are questions that people often ask. And if you think about Zero Trust, that goes back way to the original process of PULP, that Forrester actually created back in 2010, which is all about privilege and policy around how you exploit access to components to do your day-to-day job. And that's where Zero Trust comes into part of that play. It's about building those policies out. And then you've got the Zero Trust. Is it difficult to implement? Well, is it? Is it not? It depends on where you sit and what you're trying to do and how you're trying to evolve your environment, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here. Tony, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, and we're going to talk a lot more about this as we go on, but if Zero Trust, the term was a drinking game, it would be over very quickly, because Zero Trust and SASE even, they get thrown around a whole lot. So we hope that by the end of this webinar, you guys have a better understanding of what Zero Trust and SASE is, as well as kind of real kind of methodical way forward to actually try to get there yourselves in a realistic manner, as opposed to just flip a switch and all of a sudden you're SASE-fied, right? That's not the case, obviously, but yeah, we're going to talk more about that in a moment.
Yeah, and often people confuse the fact of deploying SASE means I have Zero Trust. Well, that's not true. There's two levels when you look at Zero Trust. You have Zero Trust network access, and then you have the Zero Trust architecture, which actually exploits more. Really gives you, it's like having a personal bodyguard around you all the time, no matter what you do, to make sure and keep you in check, and you're not being exploited in any way.
Okay. That's a great way to look at it. When we talk about Zero Trust and SASE, I think it's also important to remember that the attack surface that we as defenders may be responsible for defending has changed a lot over the years. It used to be that we had this, kind of castle and moat architecture, and that we were just kind of concerned with what happened on the edge of the castle, exterior, and then what happens inside. But now, we have complex infrastructures, cloud infrastructures that we have to manage as well. and most of the time remotely. We never step foot into these physical spaces. But there's a whole bunch more that has also evolved around apps and APIs. The application ecosystem has grown exponentially. It used to be where you had kind of just a number of web applications, and they fed via backend databases. But now there's a lot more integration with APIs and mobile apps and how consumers consume data that you might be sharing, which ultimately can be another attack surface, especially in terms of malware or phishing attacks, etc. And then all of that kind of fits into this big digital ecosystem, which you also have to be able to have control over, not just with your applications and your software, but with your people and the devices that they carry. So as Andy mentioned, you need to have some kind of control as like a personal bodyguard that follows you no matter where you go, so that you can maintain the same level of security, even when you're in disparate and different environments.
So Tony, I mean, at the end of the day, every time you add another connection to the internet, every time you open up a new network port, everything that you do in the cloud, in multi-cloud, you're actually introducing a new attack service, correct? Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And even from the effect of, we've seen attacks on dead domains that are being taken over, and that dead domain and the valid certificate that is still applied there are being used for phishing attacks and for kind of watering hole type of attacks. And if your browser sees a valid certificate, you're probably more likely to click through and allow that connection, right? So yeah, there's a lot at stake here and a lot of moving parts, obviously.
Yeah, and it's those moving parts that also create a bigger problem, I think. Even when you look at the ecosystem and the architectures and structures you want to build to deliver, a SASE and a zero trust environment to a business, you've got the suppliers, you've got the contractors, you've got different logins to those systems. There's a huge risk just in that, with not bringing that together and integrating it properly.
Yes, and there's also a big risk in not being able to have your security policy be consistently delivered across those different environments, which we'll talk about in a bit as well. But that's definitely something that I would say from an operational standpoint is the hardest part of zero trust and moving towards SASE, is being able to consistently apply the best practices that you should have across all these environments that are very much different in terms of how you can control them.
And that's where it becomes important then to understand how those components blend together and how they integrate. And you need to get some governing authority or body of work together where somebody is responsible for that ultimately. Otherwise, you're going to get gaps where different environments from different participants are going to create different risks and threats where they actually touch each other's attack surface.
Yeah, and when we used to think of security, we would think of, okay, we have our own corporate data center, and then maybe we have a hosted data center, and that's where you applied your security policies. That's where you would do your audits against, etc. Then with the enablement of cloud environments and multi-cloud environments, you have to do the same thing across those environments. But those are in the number of, a few to tens, right? When you look at moving towards the edge, which is basically trying to be closer to where all of the people and devices on the internet live, you need to have thousands of touch points there, because those digital touch points go far and wide from what type of device are you communicating to. Not just so you can serve the right type of content. Maybe it's a mobile device, you're doing compressed images, you're doing the mobile version of the website. But from a policy perspective, this mobile device is now communicating on your network. How do you secure that and validate that meets all your minimum security requirements, on top of all the other types of devices and all the other types of devices that live within that ecosystem, which could be gaming devices, depending on if you're a gaming gaming platform. It could be a car communicating in, How do you secure the headset of the car? Because it's calling back to you to be able to say, hey, give me information, that I can serve to this user driving their car. We've seen even those devices become kind of a launching point for attack. So if you could extend your security ecosystem all the way down into each of these devices, that would be ideal for for moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. But I totally agree. But at the same time, you have to provide performance for those applications and those connections and the services that are running over that infrastructure down to that user or device. And it becomes even more important today from an observability perspective to understand what's not been happening yesterday, 3 hours ago, last week, and trends. It's about what happened 5 minutes ago, what happened in the last minute. Information needs to get through, especially as we move towards more smart cities and more edge-based, continuity of data to enable things to happen. We talk about Internet of Things, etc. But also to understand what that risk is and where that policy resides. So being close to the edge is really important. So when we look at the models and we look at some of the questions we asked before, are there any standards for SASE? Well, today there are none. Are there any standards for zero trust? Well, you've probably got the NIST model that you can work around, but reality is they both evolve around each other when you really look at it. Zero trust network access lives in the bottom tier, is often partnered as part of a SASE component. And when you look at SASE, isn't it really a high level design philosophy as opposed to products? There are vendors out there that are doing a full end-to-end SASE component delivery with CASB, secure web gateways, firewalls as a service. But then you've got to take into account the micro-segmentation, some of the identity access proxies that really become important to deliver that observable security solution at the edge to reduce those vulnerability risks that come through. And we'll talk a little bit about zero-day factors that perpetrate through organizations and some of the threats that creates. But also it's about not just the identity of users and devices, it's about segmenting them. It's about segmenting the access management. It's about building on those tiers and collapsing them at the same time so you've got no gaps between them, and understand that you end up then with a concise, performance, secure, visible, observable system that is also automated and therefore reduces the costs also in the transition of your data through that infrastructure. It's almost really a perfect match when the two actually come together, but they are both not real products. They're all part of an architecture, part of a philosophy. If you think about it, access design really needs to migrate outdated security technology and integrate any that have to remain. And this is where building it into a cloud services in the way that we do here with Akamai actually works. Tony, any comment?
Yeah. I mean, I just think the intersection of SASE and zero trust are kind of a like this diagram shows, kind of building blocks onto each other. Whereas zero trust is talking about inherent trust and getting away from the idea of inherent trust and moving more towards a more finite, more real-time viewpoint of what trust means within an environment. SASE is looking at, hey, there's all these other things you have to worry about when you have someone connecting into your environment. The performance, the user experience, the optimization, all on top of security. I think that's really an interesting culmination of things, which back in the old days, it was like, hey, I'm going to work from home this weekend. You get on your VPN connection on your slow dial-up, or if you had DSL at home, it was still slow. And just that experience through VPN was horrible. So this is really looking at, of course, we're many years down the road. There's a lot more bandwidth at stake, but there's a lot more users, a lot more devices that are connecting in. So trying to manage all of that is part of what this this diagram is showing.
And it's important then when you look at this and it starts to break it down, when you look at evolving a digital network application, the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure that people are transforming to in multi-cloud, especially, it's an even greater threat landscape that you have to take care of. It's really important that you should look at that through a lens of SASE and zero trust in mind, because that will provide the way that you evolve and develop things. Applications historically have developed things more around, we build an application, security is layered after it. And that's not the way it needs to be, which is why so many threats exist today. Security needs to be built in and be at the beginning as part of that process.
Yeah, that's actually kind of what we saw in our own zero trust journey, if you will. Starting about 5-6 years ago, it wasn't called zero trust, but we were, we're a multinational company. Akamai is. We have 8,000 plus employees, and we needed a way to further secure our environment for all of these, remote locations, no matter where they are, as well as provide that security optimization and threat protection that you would imagine that you would need to secure a corporate environment. So it's all about really lowering our risk profile, and we do that by layering on a bunch of different services. And as we started to kind of line up what we've built in the past for our own internal usage, we saw that we really were handling a majority of the requirements around SASE. And when you look at what this really means for us, from a big picture perspective, was we started building this for ourselves. And after we kind of built this out, Akamai traditionally has done things, web application firewall in the cloud, at the edge, and bot mitigation, all these different kind of tools and detections. And they're happening very close to where the users are, because that's where our edge, platform extends to. It's one hop away from about 95% of the world's internet users. So making your security decision right there, very early on in that user communication path, has tremendous advantages. Now, if you're doing that from a security perspective, yes, one, you can take the aggregation of all the yes or no's that you have to make and do them at scale, no matter where the requests are coming from. But two, when it comes to performance and optimization, we're seeing the real path from the user's network, wherever they originate from, all the way back to the network hop that's closest to the origin location that they're going to. And by optimizing that, we've been able to make sure that all of our users and our clients have this fast performant, well secured remote connectivity and corporate connectivity. So it's been interesting, but it all started with us really trying to do this for ourselves to make sure that we were secure.
Yeah, and the advantage you have as well is you have a lot of good data to work from across your infrastructure that helps with vulnerabilities and other areas of threat. You actually see quite a lot, so that's huge advantage of Intel.
Yeah, if you were to take remote access as an example, we built a technology, and we said, hey, we need to kind of change the way that users connect into an environment, because just kind of doing different security validations, what we found was for VPN, for instance, when you make a VPN connection, you're inherently trusting, after authentication and everything happens, you're trusting that the network that this user is coming from can talk to the network and all of the different IPs that they're given access to when they make their connection. And Andy, if you go on to the next slide, I have a kind of an example of how we look at this. Instead of creating two network connections, which is what happens through VPN, we said, what if we were able to establish the usability of an internal application, of a user being able to access an internal application or system or RDP service or whatever, without actually having that user's computer device be on the internal network. So using our platform, we do kind of a remote or a reverse proxy connection, to where instead of just creating a VPN connection or an encrypted connection, which is handling privacy, or is handling the integrity of that transport, we said what happens through that transport is also very important, right? So by having a reverse proxy connection, it allows us to be able to inspect traffic that goes from the internal network out to that remote user experiencing that internal application, and vice versa. So for instance, if you have an internal finance application, you probably, for your internal users, you do not have a web application firewall inspecting traffic from internal users to that finance application. But what about if one of the finance people has recently taken a class on web application vulnerabilities and is going to try out SQL injection? So they go to the internal web page for finance, and instead of putting the query string that they want to put for what they have access to, they look up the salary of the CEO or other personal information that's probably not totally shared. They could do that by exploiting that internal web application. So being able to do service add-on to add different types of services to your zero trust remote access connection is huge from a security perspective, but you can also accelerate that connection because again, you're in line, you're a reverse proxy handling these connections. So there's a lot of power there when it comes to validating a connection, but also not establishing this old model of trust, which is once you give me the right username and password and have the right cert, your network can now talk to my network. That's how malware outbreaks take place, as they come from a trusted device or a trusted network connection. And this aims at removing that.
Absolutely, and that's really critical. I mean, you touched on something there about the SQL injection attacks and things like that, whereby they steal the credentials of a senior C-level executive in let's say a small business, doesn't need to be a large business, and gets their financial details. Well, then there's the trigger for ransomware demands, right? So they already get the profile and they know how to go about it. And then they know what where those trigger points are to be able to get the demands of their requirements submitted very easily. So that's really important as well. But one other thing, what about you talk about applications here, Tony? What about DNS as well? Are you looking at that here?
Yeah, so not in this particular viewpoint. This is more for creating the remote connection, but using a technology that you could kind of call it a DNS firewall. We do adaptive threat protection, which is basically looking at traffic that would normally be benign, like DNS queries going out to the internet. But we said, hey, this is a huge area of potential value. If we could, like Andy said, compare this. What do we know about this request and maybe the URL or the path it's going to? What do we know about us as Akamai being able to observe 20 to 30% of the world's web traffic every day? Have we seen this request before? And did it result in a malware payload download or a C2 communication? And if so, you now can take kind of the aggregate value of everything that we see and are identifying from a risk perspective. And when a device in your network makes that call out, we can say, hey, this is bad based on XYZ, all these different things we've seen, and then stop that HTTP connection from even establishing. Because a lot of the heartbeats that come out for C2 communication are just a website visit and an HTTP request and response, right? So, but DNS is before that even happens. So being able to do threat protection here, and even if it's something we've never seen, but it looks suspicious because maybe the packet size of the DNS request is too large, or maybe there's a little text buffering area inside of a DNS request where you can add text. What if I'm taking credit card information, base64 encoding it, and putting it into that little text value of the DNS request? That would probably leave most environments all day long. But being able to look at that and establish, is this something that looks normal? And then if you don't know for sure, being able to segment that off and go to an analysis engine is really part of the building blocks of really kind of establishing, like Andy said earlier, this personal bodyguard around each of your devices and your users, even as they travel. Now, these services can follow you even when you go home, which I think is an important point, because even though a lot of us are working from home still now, we're still traveling. You'll go back to the office at some point. So you have to make sure that you can really kind of establish that trust, with users on the go.
So basically, Tony, what you're saying there really is this is independent of whether the end user is on or off a corporate network, because that's really important, that it has to travel with you. It has to be nomadic in its own policy and function as the user is today.
Yeah, and then the question comes about, well, what if there's other traffic that's not DNS related? So using the same type of edge technology, we've built up kind of a secure web gateway technology as well. So as you look at any type of request that leaves a corporate environment, being able to have that go through, instead of going all the way back to, just say you're a satellite office and you're really secure. So your security model is hub and spoke, where all the satellite offices go back to the corporate location, where all the analysis engines are and the tools, and then they go out to the internet. From a performance perspective, that doesn't really seem to fit the bill of SASE, right? So, but if you had a secure web gateway that, again, was one hop away from the users, that's where you start to see the benefit of edge architecture playing into making SASE work, for you instead of against you. Because I think a lot of people are a little bit concerned because they look at SASE and all the performance and network optimization requirements, and they're continuing to think with the old models in hand, which would be go back to corporate, hub, and then go out to the internet. But there are different models at play here that can benefit you.
That's very true. And 0 day is one of those threats that people relate to quite frequently. And I think there's one area here that I think most organizations don't really get or understand is a vulnerability such as 0 day. You need a disclosure policy in the business. If you don't have a disclosure policy, then nobody, no hacker, no corporate hacker or professional is realistically allowed to report something because they've not followed procedures because you don't have a policy. And many organizations such as Google, Netscape back in the day, created policies around this to allow people to understand what those threats were, where the code's broken, and consistently look in a safe harbor where they're protected from being prosecuted. And these things need to be addressed as well as you move forward. Otherwise, you're never going to really address 0 day properly. And what you find is that they're almost like bounty hunters today. They get paid significant reward for finding certain threats in applications. But what happens is when they're paid for by the very large vendors, the likes of Google, the likes of Microsoft, they tend to not pay as much. And so they go out onto the grey and the black market to sell their wares, which is whereby some vendors of anti-malware technology actually buy some of their content and understand the threats. But realistically, even when you look at the top 2,000 Fortune enterprise customers, 4 out of 5 of those don't have a vulnerability disclosure policy. And without that, you're never really going to address 0 day.
That is a great point. I mean, if you don't have a publicly disclosed email like security@yourcompanyname.com and say, this is where you send us, if you have any hint of security misconfiguration or something, send us some information. We'd love to hear from you. That openness is pretty huge because a lot of security risk is because of lack of knowledge. So even if it's your lack of knowledge, wouldn't you love for someone else to be able to say, hey, don't get mad at me, but I accidentally made my password with these special characters, and doing so triggered a vulnerability in your in the form of your web application. I would love to know that from a user who is a good person who's trying to help out, rather than find out that this risk has been exploited later. right?
Yeah, or sold via to the ransomware
Or
bodies
sold,
out there, the
yeah.
brokers out there that will happily take it. So eventually, what it means is that, you know, anyone who discovers that vulnerability, as Tony just said, that, you know, currently there's no way to entail them or allow them to legally provide you that information. That's not really acceptable today. We have to become more agile in the way that we consume this information. It's out there. People are consistently trying to breach and take control, take advantage of business, people, all types of digital asset. And there are ways that start to enable you to take back control, really.
Yeah, and you know, to the point of 0-day, the whole idea comes to question: what other what other best practices could we be doing from a corporate perspective to limit the risk of a 0-day exploit or malware, which eventually will happen? How do you limit the risk of that? And by limiting the risk, I mean kind of limiting the scope of the available area for an attack to take place. And when you look at microsegmentation, this has been around for a long time. I used to manage internal networks, and I remember we had a Cisco 5505 switch. It had 98 ports or 96 ports, I forget. But one day we had a hardware failure, and I had to take out all the blades. The backplane was still good, but I put in new blades, and then I took the backup configuration, which had all of the carefully constructed microsegmentation and VLAN rule sets that said which port goes out to feed another switch for finance. This goes out to our PCI network, etc. And at a certain point, we came to bring everything back online, and the backup did not work. The configuration did not work, and we were kind of biding the time because these things don't happen on a Friday afternoon right before everyone goes home for the weekend. They happen on a Monday morning or a Tuesday morning, right? So that's actually when this happened. And my boss, came over and said, listen, I think we just need to get it working. Whatever you need to do, get it working. So I basically rebuilt the configuration with a flattened network and segmented the PCI part of the network as kind of the first stage before I had to go back and start to build the other rule sets. But the complexity around microsegmentation has always been one of the areas where people are like, well, we're doing it, but, I wouldn't bet my job on the fact that this is going to limit the scope and access of a malware, infection or a virus. And this has all been happening. Malware, ransomware, virus outbreaks, whatever. This has all been happening even years and years, decades after we've had great antivirus tools, great malware tools, great email filtering technology, and yet it still happens. So the idea of microsegmentation and where it fits into all the other things you're doing, from a web application firewall, DNS inspection, secure web gateway, even multi-factor obviously is a huge piece we didn't totally go into, or zero trust network access. Microsegmentation can sit across all of that. And if you do it from a software-based delivery standpoint, you now can say, hey, just like Andy mentioned about the bodyguard, this microsegmentation rule set follows this user and this device, no matter where they go in the environment or outside of the environment, to restrict the number of things that device has access to. And if you, from a software-based perspective with an agent, you can do discovery, and you can say, because when you start to go through microsegmentation, the first thing that someone says is, well, what needs to talk to what? And you're like, I don't know. I know 5 years ago when we built, these apps, what was talking then, but there's a whole bunch more. So from a software delivered standpoint, you can discover all of the different assets that an actual device is talking to before you make your policy commandment or policy change to affect that. But again, you're limiting that scope, and that's the important part.
Yeah, and that's important, because then you can apply the micro level factors across the top of that as a user identity, almost a user fingerprint at a higher level, which this then brings in the time of day. It brings in the current behavior, the behavior profiles of that user, how they normally access those assets, what they're doing today, why they're doing it here, what's different, what's an anomaly. So you can start to build those across the top of it as well. So if we look at ultimately, and I'm conscious of the time's creeping on here for questions as well. Realistically, we're trying to take security beyond just pure regulatory compliance, and it's about blending together, not just bringing technology together, but it's blending the policies, the behavior, and removing the gaps and turning up the dimmer switch in the room, if you like, so there's no shadows left behind between the components, and trying to allow business to evolve. You have to take into respect there are a number of different technologies that already exist and are deployed, and some of those will remain. They can't be removed because of the type of architecture and environment they live in. But you also have to bring along the legacy with you. You can't leave it behind, as in many cases has happened in the past. There is no option to leave any legacy behind in the policy making and the process that we bring on board here. So when we look at zero trust, it's more than access control. It's an embodiment of how you connect and consume the technology, the asset. I call it a digital currency, because that's ultimately what you're actually trading in as you're moving this data around the environment. You don't want to leave it anywhere to be breached. You want to consume it. You need the performance around that. All of those things come together in a really important perspective, and it's also important to understand most of this is cloud-driven microservices. On the back of that also increases the abuse potential. The more you go multi-cloud, the more you expand out, and we all have to do it, but get those policies in place, and you can start to ultimately understand that security knows no boundaries, but you can deliver a true security and agility and performance as you go through deployment of the new transformation into the digital world. Do I add anything, Tony?
Yeah, I think the next question would be, how can Akamai and Teneo actually help deliver this? Because I think most organizations, they either see zero trust and SASE as such a huge undertaking that they have to give it 5-year ramp time, and that may be the case. But the truth is, there are small wins that you can do to prove out the validity of these models. And a lot of times partnering with the right groups can help you get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's again, it's about delivering that comprehensive, consistent approach to protect business. Your posture is important, and it extends. Every business has a B2B element, whether they're consumer facing or not. There is a digital supply chain in business today, and every time you have those touch points, you peer with that other business. You're extending that compliance. You're extending that trust. You need to understand how to segment their journey and understand the threat that they bring and enable and broaden into your environment. And these are the things that we can help with the approach that we have together.
All right. I think I know we're kind of running short on time, so I'd love to open it up for some questions and see if anybody has anything that we didn't cover.
Absolutely. We've got more than a few. Hi, it's Seth again. Good to see you all. So let's just, here's one from the field. Do you place the DNS in front of the spam filter to allow for connection? Let's start there and then we'll dive further in.
Yeah, I might need a little bit of clarification, but I think when you look at traffic that's leaving your environment, you can effectively inspect that traffic using DNS inspection or DNS firewall. For traffic that's coming into your environment, there are settings in Exchange server and different mail servers where you can actually reverse query the domain that's sending the email in real time. And unless that domain that's sending the email can provide a valid security response or certificate response, you would just drop that as a spam or a forged email. I know a lot of spam is coming through kind of the open mail platforms these days, like Gmail or whatnot. So it's also important to look out for cases where the front of the email address is so long that it just kind of bleeds out into a ... and you wouldn't see the back of it, but it'll say Microsoft support, Microsoft dash support, blah, blah, and by the time it gets to like the 23rd character, you can't see that the domain is actually not coming from Microsoft. So if the rest of the email looks like a valid Microsoft communication, hey, we noticed there's a problem with your computer. Here's a link to update it. You could fall victim to that, by accident. So hopefully that kind of helps, address that a little bit. But yeah, you definitely do have a lot more effect of traffic leaving your environment rather than coming into your environment from an email perspective.
Excellent. Next question. Can you speak for a minute on how legacy apps can be protected? A reverse proxy arrangement that verifies the user before allowing access to the legacy system.
Yeah, I mean, this really goes into a lot of what types of checks can you do to validate as a request is coming in to get access to a legacy system. So the stitching of that legacy connectivity it usually is just either it's possible or it can be made possible via a little bit of work. But validating the user and the device the user is coming from, Andy mentioned this earlier, being able to do device posture assessment checks to say, is this device up to date with the most recent security updates? Have we seen this device before is also very important. From a multi-factor authentication perspective, this comes into play quite a bit too. You want to know, should I be allowing this device even if they have the right username and password credentials? Because the big problem here is that the attackers have found out the right username and password combinations, whether it's through a phishing portal where they said, hey, go here and log in, and now I have your Gmail credentials. Or if it's via another method, they a lot of times are presenting the valid username and password. So just having that as a validation is not enough. And even so, if it's malware on a device that already has a certificate, now the connection is already trusted through that service as well. So, but yes, with the reverse proxy connectivity, you can look at things like doing a device posture assessment. How often do you recheck that assessment in case something has happened during the course of that connectivity? Seeing where they're coming from. Did they just log in from New York City and now they're logging in from Dallas, Texas? Is that strange? Maybe, right? And then also being able to take input from other tools. If you have other software-based agents that are doing analysis of your devices, being able to feed that into your remote access technology to say, hey, as I establish a connection, does this meet the requirements, and does it continue to meet the requirements over time? So that's how we look at that.
Yeah, and that's where observability really kicks in, Tony, because at the end of the day, having a constant active observability means you can track what's actually going on whilst the user is actually connecting with that asset to see whether there are any anomalies, and you can react almost instantly to them. You can either flag an alert or you can actually cut the communication if it is a red alert, and those things can be tied into policy as these things move forward, which is really important, and that helps again protect the legacy.
Speaking of policy, this might be the last question because we're running low on time. Does Zero Trust and SASE help or hurt compliance initiatives?
That's a really interesting question because in one way they definitely help. In another way, if they're implemented wrong because they're not thought of as an architecture, they're not built together as a solidified, unified framework of components, and when they're built as components, that's where they become a challenge, because that could breach your compliance because you got the breaks between that integration. The integration needs to be really tight and understood, so that you'll never always get it perfect if you're doing a wide range of bringing tools in. So in some ways it will help compliance, and it should do it eventually if you've got the right process, policies, and architecture planned for. As I mentioned before, when you roll these technologies out, and they're technologies, they're not each of these vendors do not provide a complete overarching solution right the way through end to end today. It's not there because people already have something. It's seeing it through the lens of security, seeing it through the lens of what you want to achieve from a SASE perspective and a zero trust perspective, and build on those. If you build on those policies first, and we can help with those architectures, we can help bring those out, you can make sure that it does more than compliance, it takes you beyond compliance.
And I'll just add real quick too, Andy, I love the term observability. Observability to me is the upgrade to auditability, right? And compliance is all about auditability, right? What can you audit after the fact to show that things are secure, right? But we all know that the checkbox audit does not mean you're secure. So observability, and as you said, Andy, to make sure that whatever technology you use, that you're not looking at kind of point solutions and building this disparate architecture. But if there's a way to put together an architecture that grows, that can grow in a modular way as you need the different pieces of that technology, that's the ultimate way. Because that way you're getting the same security validation and security posture set across all of your environments at the same time, instead of just picking and choosing as you go. I think that's an important factor as well.
Excellent.
Yeah,
there. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I was going to say, but basically you're buying into an approach, and this is what you're doing. If you buy into the approach, you can evolve your environment to have that security posture and the compliance level that you need way beyond it. And that's what's important. If you don't do that the right way around, you're going to struggle, and you will have problems with compliance.
Perfect. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Very much appreciate it. Another great session here. We'll make our way into the next session now. Thank you so much for your time and your insight, Tony, Andy. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.